They smiled in your face and stabbed you in the silence. They wore your kindness like a cloak, only to tear it apart behind closed doors. You gave them your trust, your time, your open heart, and they treated it like a disposable offering. And when you fell, they cheered. They thought your fall was final, but what they forgot is that the universe watches in stillness, and in that stillness, it remembers, it balances, it waits. What they took for weakness was grace. What they mocked as silence was strength. And now, without warning, without mercy, the very wheel they spun in arrogance is turning, full circle, toward them. The mask always slips, eventually. They come into your life draped in warmth. Their words, sweetened with rehearsed sincerity, feel like safety. They mirror your hopes, your wounds, your dreams, and you begin to believe you've found something real, a connection perhaps, a bond. But there's something else beneath that smile, isn't there? Something you couldn't quite name at the time, a flicker in their eyes that didn't match the softness of their tone, a pause too long, a laugh too sharp, a compliment that felt like a hook. And yet you brushed it off, because your heart was open and theirs was pretending to be. They wear masks, these people, masks made of borrowed empathy, of carefully chosen words. They study what moves you, what shakes you, what gives you meaning, and they play it back to you like a performance. Not to connect, not to care, but to control, to pull you in, to build your trust, and once you're in too deep to see the exit, they shift. Slowly at first, the warmth cools, the support turns conditional, your wins begin to bother them, your questions irritate them, and your boundaries, they're treated like insults. Still you hold on, still you try to fix the cracks, still you tell yourself they're just going through something. But what you don't realize yet is that their mask is slipping. Not because they're tired, but because they never meant to wear it forever. They can't hold it forever. No one can pretend that long. Not when they're pretending to be kind, to be loyal, to be human in ways they haven't earned. Eventually, the mask they wore to get close to you begins to betray them. You start noticing their contradictions, the sudden defensiveness, the jokes that cut a little too deep, the blame they shift onto you when things go wrong. And somewhere deep inside you feel it, the unease. That small voice you silenced starts to speak again, louder now, clearer, telling you something's off, something's wrong. And then comes the slip. It's subtle. It might be a look of contempt when they think you're not watching, a lie that unravels because they forgot the version they told you, a moment when their mask falls too low and you see what's underneath. Not love, not care, but calculation, resentment, envy. You see the truth, even if they rush to cover it again. But once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. That's how it starts. That's how the unraveling begins. They'll try to adjust the mask, smile wider, speak softer, offer sudden affection as distraction. But it won't land the same, not anymore, because something in your soul already knows the illusion has cracked. And from that point on, every word they say, every gesture they make, feels like a desperate performance. You watch them now, not with trust, but with distance. You study the cracks, the inconsistencies, and whether you confront them or walk away in silence, the truth lingers in the air between you. Because once a mask begins to slip, it never truly stays on again. You carried the weight of their sins in silence. You knew something was wrong, long before you could explain it. It was in the way your stomach tightened after certain conversations, in the way your confidence slowly started to erode, even though they never raised their voice. They didn't have to. Their power wasn't loud. It was subtle. It lived in glances, in dismissive sighs, in the way they'd change the subject when your pain was too inconvenient, and so you learned to stay quiet. Not because you didn't feel it, but because you were made to believe that your feelings weren't valid, that your hurt wasn't real unless they agreed it was. They handed you a burden made of their insecurities, their guilt, their manipulation, and you carried it, quietly. You carried the blame for things you never did. You apologized first, even when your heart screamed that you were right. You adjusted yourself, bent yourself, softened your truth so they wouldn't feel threatened by your strength. And every time you did, a piece of you dimmed. You buried your questions, your instincts, your voice, all in the name of keeping the peace. But the peace was never real. It was a leash they disguised as love. They knew what they were doing. Maybe not always consciously, but deeply, instinctively. They knew you were the kind who felt deeply, who cared enough to reflect, who wouldn't walk away just because it got hard. They saw that, and they used it. They projected their chaos onto you, made you the villain in stories you never wrote, and when things fell apart, they stood back and watched you pick up the pieces, then blamed you for bleeding. And you, strong, patient, loyal, you bore it, not because you were weak, but because you believed in redemption. You believed people could change. You hoped that your silence, your loyalty, your compassion might open their eyes. But it didn't. It only fed the illusion that they were above accountability, that they could harm without consequence, that your silence was consent. But your silence was never consent. It was survival. It was you trying to preserve something that didn't want to be preserved. It was you choosing to suffer quietly rather than escalate the war. And yet, every wound you carried became heavier, not because you couldn't bear it, but because they kept adding more, slowly, strategically, like they knew you'd never drop it, like they were counting on your silence to keep them from facing what they'd done. You became the confessional they never respected, the mirror they avoided. You absorbed their shadows, hoping they'd one day see the light. But instead, they mistook your grace for ignorance. They believed they had fooled you, that they were clever enough to lie, deceive, and manipulate without consequence. What they didn't realize was that you saw everything. You just chose not to scream. You carried their sins in silence, not because you didn't notice, but because you were waiting, watching, measuring the depth of their deceit. They laughed too soon, but the story wasn't over. There was a moment when they thought they had won, when they believed your silence was surrender, when they mistook your withdrawal for defeat. You stepped back and they called it collapse. You chose solitude and they named it isolation. They whispered to others that you were broken, ruined, finished. And oh, how they laughed. Not always out loud. No, some people know how to laugh with their eyes, with their absence, with their sudden indifference, like you were a chapter they had closed and tossed aside. They wrote you off before your story was even halfway told. It's a beautiful thing when a woman says to someone, "They celebrated too early." Smirks behind backs, conversations with half-truths. They painted themselves as the survivors, the heroes, even the victims, while you were still bleeding. They thought they were safe in the shadows of your pain, as if your suffering guaranteed their safety, as if their betrayal would be buried beneath your heartbreak. They didn't understand that every step you took away from them He was a reckoning in progress, a quiet rising, the kind of rising that doesn't need noise, or witnesses, or permission. Because while they were gloating in the silence, something in you was rebuilding, slowly, steadily, like breath returning to lungs after too long underwater. The parts of you they tried to dismantle, your strength, your clarity, your will began to reassemble, sharper than before. They thought they had shattered you, but all they did was break the shell you had outgrown. And while they were busy performing their victories to the world, you were writing a return they never saw coming. People like that live for the short game, for the thrill of the moment, for the illusion of power. They're addicted to instant validation, to the applause of the naive and the silence of the wounded. They forget that real stories take time to unfold, that real growth happens in the dark, in the quiet, in the pain. They forget that the strongest people are forged in fire, not comfort. And so they danced on the ashes of what they thought was your end, never imagining that those ashes would rise again. Not as who you were, but as someone they no longer recognized. They laughed too soon, laughed when you were grieving, laughed when you were questioning your worth, laughed when you disappeared from rooms, thinking you had nothing left to offer. They didn't realize that your absence wasn't emptiness, it was evolution, that your quiet wasn't defeat, it was direction. They only saw the fall, never realizing it was followed by flight, because they never had the patience to watch the whole story. They only paid attention to the moment that made them feel superior, the chapter that made them feel safe. But stories like yours don't end in betrayal. They don't end in loss or silence or retreat. Stories like yours turn, they bend, they twist, and they return to center with a force that rewrites everything. And when that force arrives, it's not loud, it's not vengeful, it simply reveals the truth that was waiting all along. Karma doesn't shout, it whispers when it arrives. Karma is never in a hurry. It moves slowly, deliberately, like a shadow cast by the truth. It doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need applause. It simply waits, calm, patient, quiet, until the moment is right. Because karma doesn't rush in with thunder and fury. It arrives in whispers, in subtle shifts, in small cracks where their perfect world starts to tremble. And when it comes, it doesn't announce itself. It just begins to unravel what was built on lies. Each they thought they were above consequence, that because they walked away untouched, they had escaped the weight of their choices. They mistook time for forgiveness, silence for amnesia. They convinced themselves that you were just another lesson, not a turning point. But what they never realized is that karma doesn't need your anger to work. It doesn't require revenge. It's not driven by your pain. It's driven by balance, by truth. And truth has a strange way of resurfacing when the masks are down, when the crowds are gone, when they're alone with nothing left to distract them from what they've become. It begins with the discomfort they can't name, that restlessness that follows them into rooms where they once felt powerful, that sudden emptiness in conversations where their voice used to dominate. It comes in the form of relationships that mirror what they once did to you. A friend who betrays them with the same smile they once wore. A lover who lies with the same conviction they used against you. They taste the very poison they once fed you, drop by drop, and they don't understand why things keep falling apart. Karma doesn't explode, it corrodes. It eats away at the foundations they built from manipulation and deceit. Their charm begins to lose its shine. Their words, once sharp and convincing, start to sound hollow. And the people who once rallied around them begin to drift, not because anyone exposed them, but because energy doesn't lie. something about them begins to feel off, misaligned, uneasy. And so the isolation begins, quiet, gradual, inescapable. They scroll through old photos, revisit old messages, trying to recapture a time when they felt in control. But something feels different now, heavier. They can't laugh the same, can't rest the same, because something within them knows, even if they don't speak it, even if they never admit it, something inside them whispers what they did, and that whisper gets louder in silence, in stillness, in solitude. That's where karma does its work, not in spectacle, but in still moments, when there's nowhere left to run from themselves. It's not about revenge. It's not about watching them suffer. It's about knowing that justice doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like self-confrontation. Sometimes it looks like living with the echo of the harm they caused. An echo that only grows louder when everything else grows quiet. Because that's the thing about karma. It doesn't knock at the door. It slips in through the cracks they never thought would open. You rose without revenge, and that's why they fall alone. You could have fought back the way they did, by tearing down, by shouting louder, by mirroring the same cruelty they offered you. You could have exposed them, humiliated them, gathered every truth you held back and turned it into a weapon. You had the power, you had the story, you had every reason, but you didn't. Not because you were weak, but because something inside you refused to become what hurt you. You chose a different road, the harder one, the lonelier one. The road where healing was quiet, where dignity was preserved, and where peace meant more than proving a point. They expected you to strike. They braced for retaliation, and when none came, they mistook your restraint for defeat. What they failed to understand is that silence is not surrender, it's self-respect. You weren't ignoring the pain, you were processing it in ways they never had the patience or depth to comprehend. While they clung to their illusions, you were letting go. While they hid behind manipulation, you were confronting your truth. And slowly, piece by piece, you are rebuilding, without needing to destroy anyone else in the process. That's what separates you. Not that you were never broken, but that you refused to pass your pain forward. You chose to grow from it, not spread it. You walked away not to punish them, but to protect yourself. And that decision, though it cost you in the moment, became the very reason they can't escape what's coming now. Because what you left behind was not just a memory, it was a mirror. A mirror they can't avoid. A mirror that reflects the version of themselves they tried to hide. There's a special kind of justice in watching someone realize that the person they tried to break didn't retaliate, but rose. Quietly, graciously, completely. And in that rising, you took away the one thing they relied on most, your reaction. You denied them the performance they expected, the chaos they were prepared for. Instead, you healed, you evolved, you moved on. And without the fuel of your pain to feed their narrative, their mask began to rot from the inside. They fall alone, not because you pushed them, but because no one stays near a person who builds their identity on destruction. People eventually feel the difference between authenticity and performance, between confidence and control. And as you became more whole, they became more exposed. Not through revenge, but through contrast. Your peace made their chaos obvious. Your stability made their instability impossible to hide. And their world, once held together by lies and borrowed strength, began to collapse under the weight of its own emptiness. You never needed to point a finger. You never needed to raise your voice. Your growth was the verdict. Your peace was the evidence, and in the silence of your absence, they are left with everything they tried to escape. The truth, the guilt, the echo of a love they never deserved.